Publius Popillius Laenas, Consul 132 BCE. Taking office as consul in 132, Popillius and his colleague were tasked with investigating and punishing the remaining supporters of the recently slain Tiberius Gracchus. When his colleague Rupilius was selected to take over Rome's war effort in Sicily, Popillius gained full oversight of the commission. Although he had the authorization of the Senate, and he was far from the only person pushing such a measure, he managed to incur the special wrath of the Roman people, who still supported Gracchus's policies and eagerly anticipated the day when Tiberius's younger brother Gaius would take up the mantle of popular leadership. In the meantime, Popillius etched his name in the history by overseeing the construction of the Via Popilia, connecting Rome with South Italy, and possibly also founding a colony in the northeast of the Italian peninsula. Despite these solid achievements, however, Popillius's legacy was subsumed by the story of the Gracchi, and he has been remembered more as a bit player in that political drama than as the builder of one of Roman Italy's most consequential thoroughfares. In the consular election for 132, Publius Popillius Laenas was elected as the patrician consul. His plebeian colleague was Publius Rupilius. What's curious is that our sources always introduce the pair and then note that Rupilius was the more highly regarded of the two men. Now, that strikes me as being rather odd. Why would the sources go out of their way to point this out, especially given that the sources tend to have a bit of a patrician bias and rarely talk about a plebeian being the better man? There are a few possibilities that come to mind. One is something that the sources most likely would not have bothered to point out, but is still worth noting anyway. If we think about how Roman elections worked, and we think about the division of the consulship into the patrician and plebeian consulship, we have to remember that the plebeian consulship required considerably less political skill to acquire. If you were born into the right family, you basically were given political affirmative action. When you ran for consul as a patrician, you had far fewer people to compete against. It was rare to have more than 2 candidates running any given year for the patrician slot. However, the plebeian slot could see anywhere from 3 to 6 candidates running. Usually not 6, but it was possible because there were a much larger number of men who had attained sufficient rank to seek the consulship as a plebeian. So for Rupilius to become consul would be much more difficult, and accordingly he would need to have more skill and savvy than if he were a patrician. It's also possible that they point out that Rupilius was more highly regarded because Popillius was not the most pleasant guy in the world. People who tended to be abrasive and make a lot of enemies tended to have it noted that they were assholes, to put it bluntly. But I think the most intriguing possibility of all is that Popillius is slighted in this way because he was a supporter of Tiberius Gracchus. Now, I don't know this for certain, and there's no way to know based on the state of the evidence. However, if we think about the context of the election of 132, the election took place prior to the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, and at that time there were still a number of very prestigious individuals who were backers of Tiberius Gracchus, including Tiberius's father-in-law Appius Claudius Pulcher, who was one of the 3 most prestigious men in the Roman Senate at that time, and a patrician to boot. So it's not inconceivable that Popillius ran for consul as someone who would uphold and defend the legacy of Tiberius Gracchus, and that Rupilius ran as an opponent, and therefore the sources, who tend to be very oligarchic leaning, decided that Rupilius was the better man of the two. At any rate, we don't know exactly what they ran on for the consulship, but we know that they anticipated either having to uphold Tiberius Gracchus's legacy or try to repeal it. Neither of them thought for a second that they would be cleaning up a massacre, because, as we're all aware, Scipio Nasica, the Pontifex Maximus, took it upon himself to gather his supporters with cudgels and go murder Tiberius Gracchus and some of his chief supporters in the Forum. So That created a crisis, and the Senate ultimately decided to more or less back up what Scipio Nasica had done with their official support. Not long after the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, the two consul-elects came into office. When they first entered office, the Senate created a commission that would be headed by the two of them, which was designed to investigate and prosecute any of Tiberius Gracchus's surviving allies. The two consuls undertook this duty with some aplomb. However, Publius Rupilius was relieved of this duty when he was sent to Sicily in order to take over Rome's war effort in the First Servile War. Rome had already been at war for a few years, and so they wanted a more senior commander with a larger army. This meant that Rupilius was out of the way for the whole year, and the vast majority of the responsibility for carrying out the commission fell upon Popillius. The consuls, but of course mostly Popillius, executed and banished many more followers of Gracchus than died in the initial battle with Scipio Nasica. Most of the men who were slain or banished were Romans of modest standing or even poor men who were outspoken supporters. None of the supporters of the Gracchi in the Senate were touched, nor were people touched who had strong connections to senators. Among the victims were the Greek friends of Tiberius Gracchus, who of course were not necessarily political actors in a direct sense. They were more advisors or even tutors of the Gracchi brothers. Diophanes was actually executed, whereas Blasius fled from Rome before they could get him, and he ended up joining Aristonicus in Pergamon, where he was involved in a revolt against the Romans. Recently, the last king of Pergamon had died and then bequeathed his kingdom to Rome, and so Blasius went there to join Aristonicus, who was in revolt, in order to reassert Pergamene independence. Senate-level Gracchans, as I mentioned, such as Appius Claudius Pulcher and Marcius Fulvius Flaccus, not to mention men who were not quite old enough to be in the Senate yet, such as Gaius Gracchus, were untouched. It's almost as if Roman justice was meted out unfairly on the basis of class and status. Whereas Rupilius's duties as consul saw him detained in Sicily for the entire year, Popillius was able to wrap up the special commission and move on to better things. He got involved in public works and was able to leave his name on at least one and possibly two important pieces of Roman construction. He oversaw the construction of the Via Popilia, a road which took its name directly from him. The Via Appia connected Rome with Capua, and then the Via Popilia extended the reach of Roman roads down the west coast of Italy to Rhegium at the toe of the boot of Italy. That, of course, is the most significant thing that Popillius achieved in his entire career. Based on etymology, a number of scholars also believe that Popillius founded a colony in northeastern Italy, although it is not 100% certain. That is to say that aside from the special commission, which of course would create some political problems for Popillius, his consulship was overall a success, just like the consulship of his colleague Rupilius. However, putting Roman citizens to death without proper trials would come at a high premium, as both consuls of 132 would find out the hard way. Despite the fact that, in true Roman fashion, Popillius and his commission had not gone after any Roman of consequence, they had managed to intimidate members of the Senate, and it was now more or less unthinkable for a member of that body to express any kind of sympathy over what had happened to Tiberius Gracchus. That even extended to Gaius Gracchus, Tiberius's younger brother, and a man who was an active member of the land commission Tiberius had founded. Gaius Gracchus's political views were well known. However, after his brother's death, and until his own election as tribune, he actually managed to keep his views quiet. That's especially interesting when we think about the fact that Gaius was young at the time of his brother's murder. He was 22 or 23 when it happened, and he was known to have a somewhat quick temper and also to express himself in relatively emotional ways by the standards of Roman orators. So that was the level of fear involved. And Gaius was so cautious that even when he was in private settings with friends and family, he still would not allow himself to be heard bad-mouthing the senators who had wronged his brother, because he was so fearful of being overheard. Despite Gaius's seeming lack of spirit, the Senate still feared what he might become, and they feared what his intentions might be. Men like Popillius would really be at the forefront of the senators fearing that Gaius would gain power as tribune and exact revenge. And a lot of the reason for that is that Popillius knew Gaius Gracchus had a case against him. So when the Senate decided to prorogue the governor of Corsica and Sardinia, it did so specifically with Gaius Gracchus in mind. It was normative in Rome at that time for junior magistrates to remain with their governor if they got prorogued. So Gaius, as a pro-quaestor, remained another year. And then the Senate tried to extend the command yet another year, despite the fact that there was no crisis. Typically, commanders were only prorogued when there was actually something going on. But Corsica and Sardinia had been dealt with. It was pacified. Eventually, Gaius Gracchus gave up on his post, came back to Rome. At first, his enemies tried to make some case that he was being neglectful of his duty, if not criminally so, and he shut them up by pointing out that it was his right to run for office, and that the rule they were trying to invoke was never actually a law of any kind. So the Senate was forced to relent and allow him to put himself forward as a candidate for tribune. Once he becomes tribune in 123, he decides to reveal what he wanted to do finally. The people of Rome already kind of knew. They had their hopes up, and Gaius went on to fulfill those hopes. Not only would he revive his brother's reform plans and even build on them, but one thing he would do, first of all, was exact a measure of revenge. He passed a law that targeted Romans who had condemned fellow citizens to death without holding a trial. The direct targets of this were the consuls of 132, Popillius and Rupilius. Popillius saw the writing on the wall. He knew that he was being directly targeted and that he would be in dire trouble if he were to be caught. So, in another time-honored tradition of the Roman elite, he decided to voluntarily enter exile to avoid being put to death or have his wealth confiscated or some other judicial punishment. So he left for exile, and then he came back in 121 when Gaius Gracchus was murdered just like his brother had been. Unlike his colleague Rupilius, for whom exile was intolerable and seems to have more or less put him in an early grave, Popillius did return to Rome, but we don't really know what he did after he came home. Most likely he died about a decade or so after his return from exile. Popillius's true legacy, of course, is the Via Popilia, which was a major highway in the Roman world and helped to boost economic activity in the Italian peninsula. But he is mostly remembered as being a minor figure in the saga of the Gracchi brothers and their failed quest for reform. It's unfortunate for him that this is his primary legacy because, of course, the role that he played as the head of the Special Commission was not all that important and could have been filled by any other consul. In many ways, he got unlucky. Not only did he come in to clean up the mess created by the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, but he didn't get the out that his colleague got by getting to go fight in Sicily and win some glory there. One thing I find interesting about the life of Publius Popillius Laenas is that you can see the relative risk of challenging the system through his experience. Basically, he went on vacation for a few years and came back. No harm, no foul, really. We have to remember that for Romans who went into exile, they did not have to give up any of their wealth, and they could easily afford to live a life of luxury outside of Rome. Another example of this, a more famous example from decades later, was the pro-praetor Verres, who was prosecuted by Cicero. Once he was prosecuted, he had the option of going into exile, and that's exactly what he did. He got to keep all of the money that he stole in Sicily, and then he lived a life of luxury in Marseille up until the time of the civil war involving Caesar and Pompey. And he was originally prosecuted back in 70. So he got to live in luxury as an exile for over 20 years. Popillius could have easily done the same thing if, say, Gaius Gracchus had lived. If we look at what happened to the Gracchi and their allies, however, they were murdered in the streets of Rome. And by the time that we get to Gaius Gracchus' murder in 121, the slaughter will include high-ranking senators. Marcus Fulvius Flaccus, who was a colleague of Gaius Gracchus, was an ex-consul, and he too was struck down in the streets of Rome. So if we look at the kind of political risk that these men incurred, it was not shared equally. And we should always remember that. The people who opposed reform needed to show no meaningful political courage, whereas those who pushed for reform had to operate under the assumption that their colleagues would at some point try to murder them and then disguise it as a legal action. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.